So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being with us. This is László speaking from Budapest, Hungary. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation for the next live webinar hosted by the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter. As I mentioned, my name is László Kemmer. I'm the president of the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. And first of all, Scott, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I really appreciate that. This is a great honor that you are with us this afternoon, this morning. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say a few words about Scott. And obviously, he is going to tell you a little bit more about his professional background. But first of all, I'd like to say a few words about him and why he's with us today. Scott is an agile project management practitioner, and he's also a consultant. And what's also very important to mention that he is an award-winning author and he is an international speaker. He has generated over $1 billion of business value in aggregate for the organization he has served. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the ball over to you, Scott, and I am going to switch off my webcam, and the floor is yours. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Hello again, I'm Scott Graffius, and this is Navigate the Phases of Team Development with Speed and Agility for Happier and More Productive Teams. I do want to mention up front that for content accessibility purposes, I've deliberately using, excuse me, relatively large size fonts wherever possible and high contrast elements. I'll also be describing the on-screen content, pardon me, in a few cases word for word, but for most of the presentation, that won't be the case. So we're off. Want happier and more productive project teams, and who doesn't? So among other things, it takes great leadership, and proven strategies can give a real advantage. You know, I think that there's a very good reason why a few years ago, the Project Management Institute, with regards to PDUs, to secure and to maintain your professional credentials, created 3 categories: leadership, technical project management, and business and strategic, because they wanted to acknowledge and recognize that those 3 areas all have significant importance. This presentation focuses in on the leadership aspect, but of course, these categories can overlap. So here we're talking about the phases of team development. And if you aren't familiar with it, this will be hopefully, and you'll let me know at the end, a good overview. And if you are already familiar with it, it will give you maybe a refresher or some new ideas to sort of adapt and adopt in your organization. So this is a framework that has stood the test of time because it's relevant and beneficial. All right, my slides keep getting stuck. There we go. So if you're a leader or you'd like to be one, and I would say that if you're in project management, you are a leader, or you're a member of a team, or you might be in one in the future, and that's for pretty much everybody, or you're just looking to develop your related skills, this talk, which is based on Dr. Bruce Wayne Tuckman's model, but it's with an entirely fresh angle. Among other things, this presentation focuses on the practical, usable strategies. So 0% theory, 100% practical information to give you the framework with tips for using in working with and leading teams successfully. So here are the objectives for this talk. At the end, you'll understand the 5 phases of team development, the characteristics of each phase, and then most importantly, then you're able to apply the usable strategies to help in navigating all of the phases from start to finish. So here's the agenda. This is how the talk is structured. First is the introduction, objectives, and agenda, and we're almost done with that. And then there's some information about me as it relates to the Project Management Institute and this topic. And then, of course, the 5 phases of team development, which is the majority of this presentation. And then lastly, a quick wrap up with a digital download if you're interested, Q&A, and feedback. And speaking of Q&A and feedback, I'm very interested in any questions that you have or any feedback, but I'm going to be focused in on delivering the content for the majority of the presentation, so I won't be watching chat. You may find it helpful to use the chat window to log any questions or comments you have along the way, and then at the end, in any remaining time we have, we can go through the chat dialogue and look at the questions, and I can take answers. Should we run out of time, or if you have questions later, because it's rather common, I found, to not necessarily have a question that comes up during the talk, but maybe afterwards, you can always feel free to reach out to me. There's contact information in the presentation. So here's some information about me. As already introduced, I'm an Agile project management practitioner, consultant, author, and speaker, and I'm honored to have spoken around the world in person and also virtually, 21 countries. This is my second talk in Hungary. And I am the CEO and principal consultant at Exceptional PPM and PMO Solutions, which is a mouthful. That's short for Project Portfolio Management and Project Management Office, but really it's everything. Project, program, portfolio, PMO, enterprise PMO, agile, traditional, hybrid. But because agile is so hot and so much in demand, people really expect a name that speaks to that. So we have a new division called Exceptional Agility, which is a division of the parent company. And quite proud of the fact that we give back to nonprofits and charities. About 20% of the work that I do is pro bono or no charge. And I'm proud to be a member of the PMI. I say that because speaking to you as a PMI member of a PMI chapter, also a member of the IEEE, Scrum Alliance, and other technical professional associations. I have the PMP, quite proud to have that. I have some additional credentials that are related to Agile and Scrum, ITIL, and Lean Six Sigma. And my background's rather diverse, everything from entertainment, government, R&D, consumer products, and more. And because we're here at a PMI chapter, I wanted to mention something that I thought you might be interested in, and that's that I'm also a contributor or writer, if you will, and reviewer of content for the Project Management Institute. Here are a few examples. I was a contributor to what is now the prior version, because the current version is the 7th edition of the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. I was a contributor and reviewer of content for the Standard for Program Management, and also the global congresses that PMI has. This is back before COVID. I review proposals for the PMI and provide recommendations, along with about 99 other people as well. So it's not just, certainly it's not just me. It's a large group of people who give feedback. So if you've ever gone to an in-person PMI global or regional event, and you're wondering how these talks get there, well, they're proposed and presented, and then folks like myself and others rate them in terms of what we believe they would, the applicability and the appeal, because there's only so many slots that can be filled at these events. Anyways, moving forward, my screen keeps sticking. There we go. I'm also quite honored that content from my books, which are 2, and talks and workshops and others have been featured and used by a variety of organizations. And here are a few, and of these I'll highlight just a handful. There's Microsoft, Ford, Broadcom, the United States Department of Energy, the New Zealand government, University of Waterloo, and many others. And here we are onto the main content here, the 5 phases of team development. So Dr. Bruce Wayne Tuckman, who received his doctorate in psychology from Princeton, did extensive research on what was originally called group dynamics, what shortly thereafter called team dynamics, group performance, team performance. So in the context of this discussion, those terms are used interchangeably. And he published his model back in 1965. Why the heck are we talking about something from 1965? Well, because it's still relevant and used. And I don't know about you, but when I took the PMP exam, there were questions about Tuckman's model in it. And the PMI has it in its PMBOK. So obviously the PMI feels strongly about it as well. So this talk draws on my own firsthand real-world experience using the model, but it's also supported by tremendous research and recommendations from a variety of organizations. I have 65 items in the bibliography for this talk. So if you're interested, I have two things that are in the digital download. One is a visual that you haven't seen yet, and the second is the detailed bibliography. This screen that I have displayed at present is intended, well, these are all examples and more that are in the bibliography, the organizations that have advocated and are using the Tuckman model. So the bibliography has 65 entries. So of the ones that I have on screen here, I'll mention just a few. Project Management Institute, of course, Scrum Alliance, Cisco, Google, IBM, Microsoft, the list goes on and on. I do want to make another comment about the bibliography. I take my role in this presentation quite seriously. I know the literature extremely well, and my knowledge isn't limited to the 65 items in the bibliography, but I had to draw a line in the sand somewhere, and that's how it ended up being 65. It could have been 665 or 6,065, really. Anyways, so these are just to give you ideas of organizations that are currently using Tuckman's model in some capacity, and to underscore the continuing relevance and value of the model, because it does originate in 1965. Many of those examples that I showed are published in the last 10 years, so it's very current. And furthermore, many of them, or I should say more than a few, have even been published in the last year. So I did want to address that because of the 1965 date of the introduction of the model. So I don't know about you, but when it comes to models, things that work for me, and from what I've read, most people, is to put them into some sort of a visual context and populate them with straightforward language and practical examples. And that's exactly what I've done here. But for me, for this talk at least, clip art just does not work. No clip art, not going to have it. There's no stock photos, and there's absolutely no generic content. It's all custom made by me for this presentation. So here is the phases of team development, which is a custom visual, just to give you the overview. And in the following minutes of this presentation, we'll zoom in on the content in detail. So as I mentioned at the top, I try to have large size font for content accessibility. Here, you won't be able to make out the detail. Rather, I just want to give you the overview of the model, and then we'll zoom in on the content momentarily. So you see at the top, you have a graph with performance moving across 5 phases: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And as you can see, the performance level, or the productivity, if you will, fluctuates across the different phases. And of the phases, we have, again, forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning, going from left to right. And below the phase markers, we have the characteristics. These are the behaviors or the things that you typically see in teams in the respective phase. So if it isn't absolutely clear what phase the team is in, you can use this information to help identify exactly where they are. Once you've done that, then you can apply the proven strategies, which is a row below that, to help the team grow and advance. And in most cases, that means moving to the next phase, going from forming to storming, for example. Sorry, my screen locks up periodically. So, but that's about the process. This is really all about people. Teams are about people. So what I wanted to do was to also have a visual to accompany the one that you just saw here. And for inspiration, I looked back to 1965 when the model was originated, for anything that I could appropriately use that resonated with me and with this topic. I didn't find anything in 65. I looked for the next year, the year after that, the year after that. But in 1969, these characters were created. And of course, this is the modern incarnation, the Lego version. But these are my photograph. These are, and these collectibles actually are rather expensive, I found out. These characters were created in 1969. And so they are going to accompany the visual you saw previously as we go through the phases of team development, just to underscore how the teams typically behave in their respective phases. Okay, so anyways, I do want to say again, while the subject matter is rather serious in terms of its importance and value, this is my attempt to interject a little bit of fun into it. So here we are, on to the 5 phases. First up is forming. Okay, in here, and I'm going to give examples that cover project management. Can be traditional waterfall, it can be agile, it can be DevOps, it can be something else, or some hybrid combination, right? So the model is agnostic in that it applies to all scenarios. The details are different, of course, for DevOps versus a traditional or a waterfall or a agile Scrum. Some of the details are different, but the model still applies. So I'm going to include a few examples from different frameworks so that you can see that, because perhaps you come from an organization where you're only practicing DevOps, or you're only practicing Kanban, or you're only practicing Agile, or you're only practicing Waterfall, or all of them. So I want to cover as many scenarios as possible within our limited time, of course. So here we have a team coming together for a specific scope, a particular purpose. So in a classic project, you have a new endeavor. Here you might have a team coming together for the very first time with DevOps. In an agile environment, perhaps you are coming together for the sprint or the iteration. So it could be people who have never worked together before, people who have worked together before, or a combination. It doesn't matter, it's the beginning is what it is here. And here's what you typically see with this group of folks. You have things are new. And with that comes a sense of eagerness, and people are socializing, and they're generally pretty polite, sticking to safe topics. But you know what? Even if information is shared up front, still this is the beginning. And things are not as clear as they will be later on in the life of the project or the team's work. So it is perfectly normal to have some team members feel unclear about exactly how they're going to fit in and how they're going to accomplish, the goals of the project or the sprint or whatever it's called. So it is perfectly normal, according to Dr. Tuckman's research, and the research since his model was published 57 years ago. There has been extensive research that it's perfectly normal for some team members to have anxiety and be questioning. You may not be surprised to hear that the more people who are on the team who have never worked on the team before, or who don't normally work on project teams, those are the folks who are most likely to have anxiety, but it really varies by company culture and the specifics of the project. I did want to share that. It's probably pretty obvious, but nevertheless, the literature is clear on that. So here are the strategies to help the team grow and advance, which means move on. Here, again, the model is agnostic. It can be a project manager, an agile coach, a DevOps manager, a tech lead. Doesn't matter what the title is, because it'll vary to the particulars of your organization. But somebody is taking the lead and making themselves very visible. Maybe icebreakers. Some companies like to do icebreakers, some don't. You don't have to, but there is value in doing icebreakers. This one might also be rather obvious and not surprising to you, but the more people who are newer on the team, the more valuable an icebreaker is. So if it's the same 5, 10, 50 people who have worked together before, you can still do an icebreaker and there's value, but there's even more value if you have more people who have not worked together before. So did want to share that. Here, providing the big picture is, the point on that is to share as much information as possible. It's perfectly normal, for example, on a traditional waterfall project, to not know everything at the very beginning. In other words, maybe you haven't developed a detailed requirements or technical designs and those kinds of things yet, right? Not at the very beginning. So you don't know everything, but what you do know should be shared with the team sooner rather than later. So if, for example, this may not apply to everyone, but let's say this is a unique project in regards to it has to be deployed and successful no later than November 1st. Well, if that's true in this hypothetical example, you want to know that right away. You don't want to know it a month or 2 months later. You want to know as much information as possible up front. So whatever is the success criteria for your organization on this project should be shared as soon as possible. So these points, by the way, you might think, well, it just seems like common sense or just good advice. And if that's what you're thinking, I would agree with you entirely. And the research would say so likewise. The points of these strategies for this phase and the phases you'll see momentarily is these are the things that are particularly valuable and powerful in helping the team move on to the next phase. So I'm going to jump to the last bullet point in the interest of time. Ensuring response times are quick. So it doesn't matter whether this is a 1-year project, a 2-week sprint, whatever the duration is, response time should be as quick as possible. That's going to be extremely helpful in getting the team to move on to the next step. I think what's happening is some dialog boxes that are popping up is locking my screen, but that's okay, I can get through it. So here we have the second phase, is the storming phase. And with this, we have people who are coming together, and there might be some level of conflict or loggerheads, if you will. So with this phase, and by the way, there's no rule on how long the team has to spend in each phase. Phases can be as short or as long as they are. I had a attendee at a talk that I did a couple of months ago who said that once she understood the 5 phases of team development, that most of her teams go through the first 4 phases rather quickly, and are into the performing phase, and then get to adjourning and close out. Haven't gotten there yet here, but that there was one project she worked on where, based on the description, they were in the storming phase for the whole project. So anything's possible. The point, though, of this presentation is these are the characteristics of the phase, and then there's the strategies to help the team that are proven in the literature and in real world use to help the team move out of that and into the higher performing phase. Okay, characteristics of the team for this, it's perfectly normal to have some level of resistance. There might be some conflict with differences of opinions, and regardless of actual job title, it's normal to have some sort of jockeying for position within the team. Who's going to make the big contribution on the project, regardless, again, of what the job titles are. And compared with other phases, there can be high emotions. Now, this happens in particular when there's a lot of team members who are new, and or they're being asked to do something they've never done before, right? So these characteristics can apply to all projects, but they tend to apply more notably where you have a lot of team members who haven't worked together before and or are doing something that they have not done before, like some new product or service that's never been developed for the company before, for example. But here's what you can do about it. Requesting and encouraging feedback. Well, that sounds rather simplistic, and I suppose it is, but really what's meant by that, the literature is clear. It's really about the sincerity and the tone, the body language, and the ease of providing feedback. For example, and I know that with remote can be different than in person, but for example, to say something like at the beginning, you come across any questions or issues or problems, large or small, please let me know right away. And you can let me know by, and then you say, however, you can let me know by email or chat or in person, or give them a list, and be very sincere about it, and make it not a one-off request. Make it an ongoing request, verbally, or maybe in your emails or whatever updates you have to communicate. So it's an ongoing thing. You don't want to know about problems, even little ones, at the end when it's too late to do anything about them. So these can go a real long ways. I don't know about you, but big issues sometimes just get sort of present themselves upon everybody, and everybody seems to know about them rather right away. The smaller issues are the ones that can really accumulate and have a real negative tax on the productivity of the team over its life cycle, or I should say over the project's life cycle, if they aren't addressed as they surface. And only by uncovering them can you facilitate their resolution. I want to jump to the last bullet point. And there have been books written, excellent books about trust. In the context of this discussion, here's how you build trust. You honor commitments. That's it. I mean, the world is a complicated place. People are very complicated. But again, in the context of this discussion, you build trust by honoring commitments. I'll give one example here, and then maybe another example in the next section. An example would be if you are an Agile team, and you don't have to be, but let's say you are an Agile project team, and you're going to have a daily stand-up or a daily scrum, if you will. And you're going to meet from 9 to 9:15 in the morning every workday and talk about what you did since the last meeting, what you're going to do in the new workday, and any issues or impediments, or whatever the agenda is for that quick stand-up meeting, right? And listen, things happen. Maybe a meeting gets canceled. These things happen. But if you say you're going to have these stand-up meetings and 3 of them or 4 of them get canceled in a row, it's going to make it very difficult. It's sort of the opposite of building trust. So doing things consistently and honoring commitments is a very simple way, and usually an easy way, of building trust. Moving on to norming, which is the second highest level of performance of the 5 phases of team development. And here, this is not a hierarchy, but rather showing the connectivity of the team. And here, the purpose and goals compared with earlier phases are much more well understood. And with that comes higher confidence, improved commitment. People are engaged and supportive. If there was any anxiety earlier, which is normal, it's typically lowered or eliminated. And then the last bullet point here really speaks to the visual, and that is that the team is starting to develop cohesion. Here's what you can do to help the team move on. Recognizing individual and team efforts. You don't have to wait at the end of the project to do things like, well, it doesn't have to be a formal post-project review or a post-mortem, as it's called sometimes. You can still, capture learnings and acknowledge efforts along the way. And as applicable, learning opportunities and feedback. Here, monitoring the energy of the team, the last bullet point really speaks to, earlier when we were talking about forming and storming, it's really about being highly visible and being extremely proactive. Here, the team is at its second highest level of performance, almost at the highest level of performance. So you're kind of stepping back and only getting involved, you, the project manager, Agile coach, DevOps lead, whatever that role is, as necessary. And here we have the performing, which is the highest level of performance. It's the 4th phase of team development. And here is a very different visual. And again, this is showing I'm going to jump to the last bullet point. Demonstrations of interdependence and self-management, also known as self-organization, and really the cohesion of the team and how they're all interconnected. So here you have, along with consistent high level of performance and the production of deliverables, you have high motivation, trust, and empathy. And then here are the things that you can do to help the team grow and advance. So if you're wondering, well, how can they grow and advance if they're already in the highest level of performance? Well, the answer is this is an active phase. This hasn't been completed yet. The next phase we'll talk about adjourning, and more on that in a moment. So this is really about keeping the momentum going. So here, similar to a comment I made earlier, kind of stepping back, guiding from the side, or minimal intervention, celebrating successes or milestones. It might be a little bit more straightforward on a one-year project versus a one-week sprint. But the idea is you don't have to wait until the end, right? You can celebrate milestones along the way. The team is probably already doing collective decision-making and problem solving. If they are, they're being encouraged to continue. And if they aren't, you're encouraging them to do so in whatever fashion is appropriate for your organization. And then that brings us to adjourning, which is the fifth phase of the 5 phases of team development. And here is sort of the flip side of forming. And here we would say that in a example of Scrum, you're at the end of the iteration or the sprint. In the case of a traditional or waterfall project, the project is done and you're sort of the PMI equivalent of closeout. And in the case of DevOps, maybe you're taking a break or a pause, or you are going to do an assessment, or you're going to get ready for a new tool set. So there's some sort of a marker that you do. Even in DevOps, which is continuous, most organizations do a break or a pause periodically to check in on things. So here, anyways, adjourning applies slightly differently based on exactly what's being done in your organization. But here we have adjourning. And I do want to mention that in 1965, Dr. Bruce Wayne Tuckman introduced 4 phases of team development: forming, storming, norming, and performing. And, that was 57 years ago. But in 1977, adjourning was found to be so important that Dr. Tuckman, with a colleague of his, Jensen, updated his own model to include the 5th phase of adjourning. So if you were to Google Tuckman or phases of team development or any of those kinds of terms, unfortunately, about half of the results will say there are 4 phases. I don't know about you, but it's been 45 years since Tuckman's model was updated to include 5 phases. I would think people would be on board by now, but there are 5 phases, there are not 4. So did want to explain that. If you come across anyone who talks about 4 phases, they're clearly talking about the 1965 introduction, and they're not acknowledging the important update. Anyways, continuing on. Here, I found this to be surprising because I don't typically see this, but the literature is very clear on this. There can be sadness, even in a project that is a fantastic success, right? Everyone did a great job. Of course, there were issues or bumps on the road along the way, as there are with practically every project, but it was a fantastic success. Picture the scenario, right? The company's thrilled with the results, but people are disbanding. Perhaps the example that might resonate more would be, say, people left their traditional jobs to focus in on this project full-time or nearly full-time for a year. And it's people who don't normally work on projects, so are members of this team, and it's done. And with that comes potential sadness. But there are things that you can do about that. So the team is disbanding, and I'm going to jump to strategies to help the team grow. So the project is over, the sprint is over, there's a break in DevOps, the project was delivered. So how does the team grow? So I would expand that subtitle to say strategies to help the individuals on the team and the company grow. So firstly, recognizing change. for everyone. Just this sort of state the obvious, but this was a fantastic project, and we have achieved our aim, and we couldn't be happier, and we're eager to have you return to your former responsibilities if that's applicable. Just giving you an example. This is an opportunity for team evaluations or lessons learned. Some organizations call them retrospectives or postmortems or post-project reviews, and you can do them in any format you see fit. The typical questions that are covered in most of these types of meetings would be what went well, what didn't go well, and what would you change, kind of a thing. But they can be any questions you want. Those are just some examples of what's typically asked. Here, acknowledging the individual and the team. And I want to jump to the last bullet point and say that celebrating the team's accomplishments. This I was surprised by, but the literature is very clear, and I did want to share it with you. It's rather obvious to me that having somebody such as the project sponsor or the CEO or the chairman or the chairwoman or whoever, some person in authority in the organization to acknowledge the hard work, efforts, diligence, and success of the team. That goes a long ways. And it's not surprising to me that the individuals on the team and the team collectively benefit from that. The thing that I was surprised by is people who were not involved in the project at all, but hear the accolades and the appreciation from management about how hard the team worked and how successful they were. The benefit to the people who weren't on the project is almost as much as the actual team members themselves. They can see by what executives, what management says, and what they do in terms of the appreciation for contributions to the company. So when researchers do assessments of people's attitudes about the culture and the organization, this is something that they were surprised by, that people who hear these kinds of accolades and appreciation, who had nothing to do with the project, also benefit by hearing that. And so it can be in person, it can be a Zoom meeting, it can be in any format that's appropriate for your organization, and with the pandemic and everything going on. So the particulars will vary by organization. I do want to say that pre-COVID, a lot of organizations will have some sort of a party, an official or unofficial party. And maybe they go to a restaurant afterwards, and maybe there's even an after party. So there's a lot of different ways to do celebrations of accomplishments, but it's very important to celebrate or party, extremely important. So speaking of the retrospective and asking questions, again, what went well, what didn't go well, what would you change? Those are typical questions or points. You can ask whatever you'd like. I did want to share two that are quite different that I have found to be very, very beneficial. And so here's the first one. This is a question that the team will ask and answer. How can we, the team, make an even bigger positive impact on the company? It's a very broad question, and you get very different answers, of course, than just asking what went well, what didn't go well, what would you change? So I have found that one to be very, very beneficial. Another one that I want to share with you is the team will ask and answer, how can we, the team, achieve even greater ease of work? So maybe there was something that didn't rise to an issue or a problem or an impediment over the life of the project. But in the back of your mind, gee, I wish we had the new version of Microsoft's whatever. It would just make my life a little bit easier. And asking these kinds of questions will really help uncover things so that if implemented, of course, you have a competitive advantage. If you take these learnings and you incorporate them into the organization for the next time you do a project of this type or roughly of this type. So those are the key highlights for the 5 phases of team development. I do want to give you a very quick wrap up and then talk about the digital download, Q&A, and feedback. So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, 5 phases, according to Dr. Tuckman and the research since, are all necessary and inevitable for teams to grow and deliver results. And this presentation covered the 5 phases, described the characteristics, and then most importantly, once you know where the team is, you can apply the usable strategies to help navigate the team from start to finish. In other words, get to performing, as quickly as reasonably possible. So again, the bibliography, 65 items. This is a 2-page high-resolution PDF, the main visual used in this presentation. So if you're interested, I have this as a digital download. It is available at bit.ly/NAV-7. I'm going to hold on this slide for just a moment or so. So if you're interested, you can download that. Again, it's a 2-page high-resolution PDF. Depending on network traffic, it may take a moment or so to load on screen. And then once you have it on screen, you can save it to your computer. I also have this link or this URL on a couple of slides. There's only a few slides left in this presentation. And so I am going to move on to the Q&A section. So since from prior talks, a lot of questions relate directly or indirectly to the visual, I'm going to leave on this slide here and ask if any of the moderators on this Zoom call are able to let me know if there's any questions in chat. And if there are, if they could please read them out, and then I'll take a stab at answering them.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott. So, ladies and gentlemen, time has come to ask your questions or put your comments in the chat window. So scroll down to the bottom of your screen, look for the chat icon and send us your questions. So Scott, this is Lasse again. Let me switch on my webcam. So my question was the following, and probably we received more or less the same question from Benedek also. So I totally understand what you're talking about here, but I was wondering that, let's say I'm part of a Scrum team and there's a sprint 4 week long, and we work on a very specific deliverable. And after 4 weeks, we deliver the shippable product, as we say. Then new folks are going to join for the next sprint. Does that mean that this whole thing is going to get started again in the next sprint?
Well, probably yes. So this is a common question, and I believe I understand it well, and I also have lived the scenario myself. So even in Scrum teams where the team members don't change, but because you're on a new iteration, the scope, if you will, or the product or service components that you'll be working on are different, right? So at the end, you have the retrospective. If you are following, and you don't have to, but if you're following what most Scrum teams do, is at the end, you do a retrospective, and then you move into planning later, and then you are kicking off another iteration. So whether you have new team members or not, you are usually back at the forming stage. So the good news is that for most teams who work together quite regularly, they can breeze through forming and storming quite quickly. So much so that there is some research that says that to the naked eye, there's almost no storming involved. They don't say there's no storming, they say there's almost no storming involved. So, but yeah, at the end of the delivery of an agile team, you have at the end of the cycle, after everything you already mentioned, you have a retrospective, and then you move on to the next iteration, the next sprint. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for all the questions. I do want to also say that the characteristics, if it isn't clear where the team is, you just look to the characteristics and they'll tell you where the team is. So if you are, for example, working on a team, I'll give this example. Let's say you're working on a waterfall project, just to make it dramatic, and it's a one-year project, right? Things are a little bit different on shorter iterations like sprints, but it still applies. Mm-hmm. And let's say that you are 50% through with the project or so, and things are going pretty well. But let's say that the tech lead, and who has a lot of domain expertise in her or his head, leaves because they won the lotto or they retired, or especially if it's an unplanned departure, right? If it was planned, you might be able to do something about it ahead of time. So what will happen in some cases is, because there's been a change in the composition of the team or the knowledge or the skills or the tools, that the team is back and forming again. So if somebody new joins the team or somebody leaves the team, it doesn't guarantee automatically that the team all of a sudden goes all the way back to forming, but rather it's the behaviors that you look at with the characteristics. But let's say in this waterfall project, the tech lead leaves unexpectedly, and there is a negative impact on the performance of the team, and they are back and forming. That doesn't mean that they have to spend days or weeks in forming and storming again. It's just rather, this is where they are. It's just a reality. And then the good news is, when you know what the characteristics are, because they're rather obvious, most of them, you just simply apply the strategies, and those are very effective in helping the team move forward. So that's
okay. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. There's another question came in from James. So the question is the following. Let me read this out loud. Is this model only intended in a context of a single project? I always assumed it is in a context of the entire life cycle of a team.
Well, see, that's a very interesting question. All these questions are interesting. That one makes me pause, because I have my own personal experience, which I could speak to, and there's also extensive literature. So I'm trying to include the literature in my responses as well, to give you as much perspective as possible. So the Techman model is about people working on an endeavor. And if the endeavor is done, the people may continue working on a new endeavor or not, right? They may disband and never work together again, or it might be exactly the same people. In the case, that would be really more of a sort of a DevOps example, where unless somebody leaves the organization or somebody new comes on board, it's the same people continuously being involved in the project. The whole nature of DevOps is with continuous delivery. And that really means different things in different companies, but there's no clear ending point. There might be a pause for the team to look at its tools and its performance and do the equivalent of a post-project review or a retrospective. So parts of adjourning do apply, but this model applies to teams. And it would be teams working on a specific scope. So whether it's a waterfall project, a sprint project, or something like that. I hope that that answers the question, but I will also answer it this way. The Techman model was originally, the term was used group, and it was changed to team rather quickly. Here's my version of the elevator story, a very quick one. A group of people with something in common, like they're gonna get in an elevator, right? So that's what they have in common. They're riding an elevator. But that same group of people in that elevator, the elevator is broken. And it's been an hour and the emergency button doesn't work. And the telephone isn't working and they can't hear anybody. And they're trying to figure out how they're going to get out. They're now a team. So they're working on a very specific objective together, collaborating, And that's really what the distinction between a group which just happens to have something in common, like they're in an elevator and that's what they have in common, versus a team really working together and collaborating on a specific scope or an endeavor or a mission or a vision. So I hope that those details, both specific and broad, help a little bit with that question. If it doesn't, I'd be happy to take another stab at it, or we can follow up after this talk.
Thank you very much. There's another question came in from Benedict. So let me read this again. After a 2-week sprint, isn't the adjourning phase too much a bit? That seems like an awful lot of meetings that's hard to swallow for developers. What's your take on this?
Well, the example, as I understand it, is a 2-week project or a 2-week sprint, whether it's Scrum or whether it's Kanban or whatever the exact framework. The idea of adjourning as it applies to my understanding of the question is that there's a retrospective, and retrospectives do not have to be long. They can be, there are guidelines on the duration of a retrospective, but I have seen effective retrospectives be 5, 10, 15-minute endeavors, and some organizations spend more time than that. They spend an hour or an hour and a half or so. But if you're not practicing with Agile, one of the points of Agile is, if I may be extremely simplistic, is continuous improvement. And this really is integral to inspect and adapt, or continuous improvement, if you will, in Agile, is to have some sense of learning, not only for the organization, but for the team. And the focus is on the team, something that they can do. And usually the recommendation is, pick one thing that is under our control that we can actually implement to make our work more impactful or more successful the next time around. Otherwise, there is not continuous improvement. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, I opened the poll. So ladies and gentlemen, look for your screen, and somewhere there's a pop-up menu or a pop-up window, and we would like to hear from you how you feel about this presentation. So this is in Hungarian, but I just checked the attendee list, and right now we have 143 people, and the majority of you guys are from Hungary. So please answer these very simple questions. This is going to really help us to have a better understanding about your opinion. Okay, now there's another question, or actually it's not really a question, it's a request. It's coming from Olu. Hi Olu, thanks very much for coming. He's a regular guest. So a question or a request to you, Scott. Would you be kind and share the presentation after the call, potentially in PDF? Is it possible, Scott?
The presentation is not available. Some chapters do record, and I do allow recordings. Because the presentation deck, the static slides, are not available, that's why I created the digital download, which is really the summary of this presentation, the main visual, and then the bibliography, the 65
Excellent.
items in the bibliography. So that's why I put that together. Yeah, and I did also want to mention there's really only two, we're almost out of time, and there's 2 slides I have left that I can cover quite quickly. While please do answer the survey from the chapter, but I'm going to move on to my next slide here, and I have a request, and my request is please do the survey for the chapter. But one thing that I have found to be extremely beneficial is any feedback that you have for me. So I put together a very simple Google form. It just asks your name, your email, which is optional, and what did you think? I wanted it to be as easy and as short and as frictionless as possible. So if you can go there, I would be very appreciative of your feedback. It's at bit.ly/YES-7. And if you would like to connect with me, that would be great. And that's on your terms, of course. So if you do this short survey, at the end of it, when you hit the submit button, it will bring up a very short thank you message, and with links to LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and so on. So if you'd like to connect, that's one way you can do that. Also, some of my contact information is on the 2-page digital download. And I also have some information on the very last slide, which is right here. I hope that you're able to leverage these proven strategies to help advance the team's happiness, productivity, and success. Speaking of happiness, I do want to underscore that there have been tremendous consistent studies showing that the team's happiness and satisfaction is highest, as you may not be surprised, during the highest level of performance, the performing phase. So there are many reasons to get to the performing phase as quickly as reasonably possible, while being mindful that it's very normal, according to the literature and my own experience as well, that there are these other phases, forming, storming, as well as norming, and then of course performing being the highest, and then the end of it, the end of the cycle, being the adjourning phase. So again, I hope you're able to leverage the proven strategies to help advance the team's happiness, productivity, and success. And I have those links again at the bottom of the screen. And I hope you do the chapter survey and my short survey if you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And a lot of incoming messages. Kevin is saying, thank you, Scott. Rita, thanks so much. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, PMI, for organizing. Benedict is saying, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, the time is up. But if you would like to complete the survey, please do so now. And as Scott mentioned, go to bit.ly/NAV-7. It's in the chat window, by the way. And please complete the survey for Scott also. Again, last but not least, Scott, I'd like to say thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate great presentation. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks very much for being with us. And the final comment from my side from the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter team, that I'd really like to encourage all of you, please visit pmi.ahu or website and go to the events calendar. More to come. Pretty exciting stuff is in the pipeline, as we say. So we are going to deliver quite some good lunch and learn presentations. One of them is going to be about the chain bridge construction. And we are going to deliver another presentation where we are going to introduce the Hungarian elections after the elections, obviously. And last but not least, what I'd like to mention, that the mentoring program is still live. So if you would like to register for the PMI Budapest Hungarian chapter mentoring program, again, go to pmi.hu, click on the relevant menu item, and you can register for the mentoring, the project manager mentoring program. If you are looking for a mentor, or if you would like to become a mentor, then that's also possible. And last but not least, Art of Projects. The 10th Art of Projects is coming in November, the 3rd of November, which is the first Thursday in November this year. Art of Projects is back in-person conference. Without further ado, guys, thank you very much. Scott, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.